In the deep, quiet corners of the world, long before the calendars were marked and the clocks learned to chime, time itself moved differently. It flowed not in minutes or hours, but in seasons, in the turning of the sun and the cycles of the moon. And in this ancient rhythm, there was one night that held its breath, a night that belonged neither to the dying summer nor to the newborn winter. It was a time that stood outside of time, a seam in the fabric of the year. The old ones, the Celts, who lived among the misty hills and the whispering forests of Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man, they knew this night. They felt its power in their bones, in the chill that settled upon the air, a chill that was more than just the coming cold. They called this night Samhain. It was a name spoken with reverence, perhaps with a touch of fear, for it marked the end of the harvest, the final gathering of light before the long, encroaching darkness. Samhain, you see, was not just a date. It was a threshold. The world we walk, the world of solid earth, of rustling leaves and warm breath, felt suddenly thin. It was as if a great unseen door had creaked open, just a crack, and through that crack, the other world breathed upon our own. This was the night, the elders said, when the veil between the living and the dead was at its most fragile, as thin as a spider's silk caught in the frost. It was a time of ghosts, not the frightful spirits of later tales, but the souls of ancestors, the family and the kin who had crossed over. They were drawn back by the memory of warmth, by the scent of the dying fires and the lingering taste of the harvest. They came to visit their old homes, to walk the familiar paths, and to seek the comfort of the living. Imagine, if you will, a small village nestled in a valley, shrouded in the low-lying fog of late autumn. The crops are in. The cattle are brought down from the high pastures, secured in their pens. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. Inside the round houses, the fires are banked low, but one great bonfire is being built in the centre of the village, a communal flame against the gathering dark. This fire was sacred. It was a beacon of life and protection. The people would gather, their faces lit by the flickering orange light, their shadows dancing long and strange behind them. They would offer portions of their harvest, grains and fruits, casting them into the flames as a gift to the spirits, a thank you for the year that had passed, and a plea for protection in the lean months to come. But the ancestors were not the only ones who could cross the veil. The Celts believed in a vast unseen world populated by spirits, by the Aussie, the fairy folk, the spirits of the land. And on Samhain, these beings, who were often indifferent to human affairs, and sometimes malicious, could also wander freely into the world of mortals. They were tricksters, powerful and unpredictable. A traveller who lost his way in the woods on this night might be led astray, chasing phantom lights or hearing sweet, impossible music that would lure him away forever. A pail of milk left on the doorstep might be a simple offering to appease them, to buy peace, to ensure they passed by the home without causing trouble. It was a night of careful balance, of honouring the dead while warding off the unknown. This thinning of the veil was not just a one-way street. It was also a time when mortals, especially those with the sight, the druids, the poets, the seers, could peer more easily into the other world. It was a night for divination, for seeking knowledge of the future. The coming winter was a time of uncertainty. Would it be harsh? Would the food stores last? Would loved ones see the spring? They would look for omens in the way the bonfire flames danced, in the shape of clouds against the harvest moon, or in the patterns made by nuts roasted in the embers. Young people might try charms to divine the identity of their future spouse, perhaps by peeling an apple in one long strip and throwing it over their shoulder, hoping to see an initial in the shape it formed. These were not games, not then. They were serious attempts to glimpse the threads of fate in a world that felt suddenly open and uncertain. And so, the people prepared. They would extinguish the fires in their own hearths one by one, letting the cold of the evening seep into their homes. This was a symbolic act, a cleansing, a way of matching the darkness of the world outside. It made the home less inviting, perhaps, to any spirit that meant harm. Then, later in the night, after the rituals at the great bonfire were complete, each family would take an ember from that sacred central flame. They would carry it carefully back to their own home, back to their cold, dark hearth, and from that single communal spark, they would relight their own fire. This new flame was a symbol of unity, of community, and of hope. It was a light blessed by the priests, imbued with the power to protect the home and its inhabitants through the long, dark, spirit-filled night, and indeed through the entire winter that was now beginning. It was a promise that even after the veil closed and the world grew cold, the spark of life and community would remain, waiting patiently for the return of the sun. The embers glowed in the quiet dark of the hut, a small point of warmth in a world that was holding its breath, waiting for the spirits to pass by. And somewhere, outside in the fields, the keepers of the old ways watched the central fire, ensuring it did not die before the dawn. And they did watch, through the long, chilling hours, as the sickle moon climbed the starry dark and the fog thickened in the low places. They stood their vigil. These were the keepers of the old fire. They were not kings, nor were they warriors clad in bronze. They were the druids, the priest-poets, the men and women who carried the memory of the tribe. Their robes were heavy wool, smelling of the forest floor, of herbs, and of the sacred smoke. Their faces were carved by wind and wisdom, their eyes holding the reflection of the flames they tended. They were the anchors of the community, the bridge between the solid earth and the whispering otherworld that pressed so closely on this night. You must understand, the fire they guarded was not ordinary. It was not the simple fire of a cooking hearth or a warning beacon. This was a Tain Chname, a bonfire. It was built with specific sacred woods, oak for its strength, yew for its connection to the ancestors, apple for the soul's passage, and into it they would cast the bones of the cattle slaughtered for the winter stores, an offering of life given back to the earth. The smoke that rose from this pyre was a cleansing agent, a purification. It was a signal to the ancestors that they were honoured, and a warning to the spirits who held malice. This fire was the living, breathing heart of the community, and its light was a shield against the creeping, formless dark. The darkness of Samhain was twofold. There was the physical dark, the death of the sun, the coming of the long winter that would test the strength of the tribe. The fire was a promise of survival, a defiance against the cold. But there was the other dark, the spiritual dark. The thinning of the veil did not just let in the beloved dead, it let in everything. It let in the sluag, the restless, unforgiving spirits of those who had died without peace. It let in the pukas and the tricksters, the beings of chaos who delighted in setting mortals astray, entangling the threads of fate. The dark was the loss of reason, the fear that seeped into the heart, the profound primal terror of the unknown. The keepers of the fire stood against this. Their chants were not prayers of supplication, but rhythmic affirmations of order. They spoke the old names, names of the earth, the water, and the sky. They recited the genealogies of their people, weaving a wall of human memory that the formless spirits could not easily cross. This connection, This passing of the flame from the sacred centre to the family hearth was a story in itself. It was an act of shared trust, a belief in the light. If you feel a connection to this story, listening in the quiet of your own night, perhaps a simple subscription, a gentle click, ensures that we will meet again to continue our shared journey through these most ancient nights. For the story was far from over. Back at the fire, the Druids used the night for its other purpose, divination. As the flames leaped and danced, they saw patterns. They would cast stones, watch the flight of birds drawn to the light, or interpret the cracks that formed on a scorched shoulder blade from the offering. They sought answers for the long winter ahead. Would the stores be enough? Would sickness visit the village? Who would be born? And who would not see the spring? It was a heavy burden to interpret the whispers of fate, but it was their duty. They were the mind of the tribe, just as the fire was its heart. The ritual was one of endurance. The keepers could not rest. They could not let the fire gutter or die. To do so would be to invite disaster, to show weakness to the unseen world, to break the circle of protection. They fed the fire log by log, chant by chant, hour by hour. They were the masters of the threshold. While the rest of the village huddled behind their newly consecrated hearths, listening to the wind moan outside, the keepers stood exposed, their faces raw from the heat and the cold. They were the waking dreamers, their feet in the mud of the mortal world, their minds touching the fabric of the beyond. They held the balance. They ensured that when the veil finally thickened, when the first hint of grey light touched the eastern hills, the spirits that belonged to the other world would return there, and the souls of the living would remain firmly rooted in their own. As the night wore on, the great fire would begin to sink, its fierce roar diminishing to a steady, pulsing glow. The energy of Samhain was finite. The portal, however wide, could not stay open forever. The keepers would feel the change in the air. The oppressive electric quality of the atmosphere would begin to fade, replaced by the simple, mundane cold of a late autumn morning. Their vigil was ending, but the safety they had woven was centered on this sacred fire, this protected village. The fire kept the home safe, a circle of light in an uncertain world, but the veil was thin everywhere on this night, not just at the village edge. What of the soul who had to walk in the dark, away from the fire's gaze? What of the person caught between settlements or the youth sent on an urgent errand? For them, the fire's protection was too far away. They would need another kind of magic, a different kind of shield. They would need to hide their very nature, to hide the fact that they were human at all. For the traveller caught in the twilight, far from the ring of the village bonfire, the world was a different place. The protection of the Tyne Chnam, the great bonfire, was a distant orange smudge against the horizon, a memory of warmth. Here, in the deep woods, the only light came from above. It was the Druids' moon. This was what they called the full moon of Samhain, a cold silver disk that hung in the black sky, seeming to watch. It was not a comforting light. It did not warm. Instead, it illuminated the world in sharp spectral relief, turning the familiar forest into a place of strange shadows and bleached, ghostly shapes. The gnarled branches of the oaks looked like grasping claws, and the mist that coiled around the tree trunks seemed to breathe. This was the Druids' true temple, and their place of greatest trial. The forest, on this night, was not empty. The air was thick with unseen movement. The rustle of leaves was not just the wind. The snap of a twig was not a fox. It was the owl sea, the fairy folk, the spirits of the ancient mounds and hidden rivers, and they were agitated, powerful, and abroad. They were the original inhabitants, and on this one night they reclaimed their dominion, moving freely among the mortal trees. They were drawn to the strong, bright energy of human life. A lonely traveller was a beacon in their world, a flickering flame of warmth and emotion in the cold primal night, and to be noticed by them was seldom a good thing. They might steal your name, your shadow, or your sanity, leaving you an empty husk to be found at dawn, covered in frost, with your eyes wide open, staring at nothing. The druids, the keepers of the fire, knew this. Their wisdom was not confined to the village circle. They had spent their lives listening to the forest, learning its secret language, its rhythms. They knew the laws of the other world. They knew that on Samhain the spirits were not necessarily hunting humans, but they were drawn to them. A human walking upright, their face bare, their breath pluming in the cold air, was a stark, loud, and obvious thing. An intrusion. The druids taught that to survive the forest on Samhain, one could not challenge the spirits. One could not fight them with iron or fire. One had to become invisible, not in the physical sense, but in the spiritual one. One had to blur the lines, to smudge the bright, clear outline of their own humanity. And so, this is what the lone traveller would do. Using the ancient whispered knowledge, he would stop. He would find a patch of damp earth, rich with the decay of the dying year, and he would smear the cold mud over his face, his hands, any exposed skin. He would cover the scent of his own living warmth. He would weave damp leaves, brittle ferns, and strands of ivy into his cloak. He would find the discarded skin of a snake, or the rough hide of a goat, perhaps even the pelt of a wolf, and drape it over his shoulders. He would hunch his back, altering his very shape, trying to mimic the shambling gait of a beast of the woods, or perhaps something else, something that belonged to the night. He would become a thing of shadow and earth, a moving part of the forest's own decay. If you are listening to this now, perhaps in the comfort of your own room, feel the echo of that ancient forest. Feel the chill, the desperate need to blend in. This story, too, is a kind of echo. And if you find a whisper of truth in it, a quiet click on the subscribe button ensures that our paths will cross again, that these echoes from the ancient past will continue to find you. The act of subscribing is, in its own way, a lighting of a small digital hearth, letting me know you are there, listening in the dark. This act of disguise was not a game. It was a ritual of survival, born of profound fear and respect. Under the cold, watchful eye of the druid's moon, this traveller was no longer a man. He was a spirit, a ghost, a shambling, earthy creature of the Samhain night. He was hiding his soul by hiding his face. The spirits of the forest, the capricious owl sea, might pass him by, mistaking him for one of their own, or perhaps for a simple, mindless creature of the earth, not worthy of their attention. He would walk in silence, his heart a cold stone in his chest, not daring to speak, not daring to look directly at the strange, fleeting shapes he glimpsed in his peripheral vision. The pale women dancing in the frosty clearing, the small dark men hammering on the roots of a tree, the great black dog with eyes of green fire that watched him from the thicket. These were the first echoes, the first attempts by mortals to navigate the thinned veil, not by fire, but by cunning. The wisdom of the Druids was this: on the night when the spirits walk the earth, do not let them know you are a man. Do not show them your face, the mirror of your soul. This lesson, learned in the terror of the ancient moonlit forests, would not be forgotten. It would seep into the bones of the culture. Long after the Druids themselves had faded into the mists of legend, long after their sacred groves were cut down, this one idea would remain, a powerful, resonant echo. The idea that to be safe on this night, you must become something other. You must wear a new face. And so, the traveller continues his slow, mud-caked journey, his own identity buried deep beneath the mask of the wild, his human features lost to the spectral gaze of the moon. And so the lesson learned by that lone traveller, shivering in his borrowed cloak of leaves and mud, was not forgotten. It became a story told by the hearth, a piece of vital wisdom passed down as the winter nights grew long. The forest had taught them a truth. The spirits of Samhain, the powerful Aosi, were drawn to the clear, bright human face. They were drawn to the soul they saw shining in the eyes. To be safe, you had to become illegible. You had to erase the self. And as the years turned, this desperate, improvised act of survival, it hardened, it crystallized. It became a ritual. It became the time of the masks. This was not the work of a single night. In the quiet days leading up to the thinning of the veil, the work would begin. A man might find a piece of ancient pale birchwood and with a sharpened flint begin to carve. He would not carve his own likeness. He would carve a face of the other, a hollow-eyed, gaunt expression, a face that looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of a bog, serene and unsettling. Another might take straw, the dry, empty husks of the harvested grain, and weave them tightly into a mask that had no human features at all, just a round, blank sun-wheel shape. A woman might take a dried gourd, hollowing it out, cutting simple round holes for eyes and a jagged slit for a mouth, a face that was a pale, empty echo. These were the masks of the forgotten. They were not for play. They were sacred, powerful tools. They were vessels of transformation. When a villager placed that wooden, hollow-eyed mask over his own features, his world changed. His breath sounded loud and strange in the confined space. His vision was narrowed, tunneling his focus. The world outside looked different, framed by the carved wood. He was no longer just a farmer or a father. He was, for this one night, something else, something anonymous, something that belonged, if only for a few hours, to the spirit world. He was hiding his soul in plain sight. This, the Druids taught, was the deepest magic. The spirits, the tricksters, and the wandering dead who crossed the veil would see these figures moving through the village. They would see a creature of straw, a being with a wooden face, a spirit with the skull of a deer. They would not see a man. They would not see the warm, tempting light of a human soul to toy with or to steal. By wearing the mask, the villagers were essentially saying, "We are not here. The people you seek have vanished. There are only spirits here. Only us." It was a profound act of communal camouflage, a whole village disappearing into the spiritual landscape of Samhain. And a strange thing happened. Once hidden, they were no longer afraid. The masks that were meant to hide them also emboldened them. They no longer needed to cower by their hearths, listening to the wind. They could move on this night. They could become part of the chaos. They would leave their homes, not as individuals, but as a procession of the forgotten. A silent, shuffling parade of straw men and wooden faces, their forms bulky and strange under heavy animal pelts. They would move through the lanes of the settlement, a community of ghosts, as we continue to gaze back into this deep past, watching these strange, masked figures move through the twilight. It is a reminder of how long these stories have travelled. If you feel a part of this journey, a quiet thread connecting you to these ancient forgotten faces, a simple click of the subscribe button is like a hand reaching out in the mist. It ensures we do not lose each other as we continue to walk this old shadowed path together. This procession, this mumming, was the villagers' own response to the spirit world. They became a part of the night's strangeness, and in doing so, they also took on another role. They became the mediators. They would walk from house to house, these eerie, silent figures. A family inside, safe by their newly lit fire, would hear a soft shuffling knock. They would open the door, not to their neighbours, but to a group of spirits standing in the cold. The masked figures might not speak. They might gesture, or make a strange low sound like the wind. The family inside understood. These were the spirits, or at least their representatives. They would offer the figures a portion of their feast, a piece of bread, a handful of roasted nuts, a sip of ale. This was an offering given to the IOC, a tax paid to the invisible world to ensure peace and a mild winter. The masked guisers, in turn, accepted the offering on behalf of the spirits. By acting as proxies for the other world, they tamed it. They turned a night of potential terror into a manageable communal ritual. They were no longer just hiding from the spirit world. They were now actively managing it, negotiating with it through this strange, silent theatre. They were the anonymous dead, the earth spirits, the forgotten ancestors, given form for one night, come to collect their due. And when the offerings were given, the masked figures would move on, disappearing back into the fog, their shapes dissolving, leaving the family safe and blessed, having fulfilled their obligation to the unseen. These traditions, born of the mist and the moonlight, were isolated, held within the deep folds of the Celtic lands. The people who practiced them, who carved the wooden faces and wove the straw masks, they knew only their own small corner of the world. They knew the forests, the hills, and the sacred groves. They knew the laws of Samhain. They did not know that far to the south, under a warmer, bluer sky, another power had risen. A power of marble and iron, of legions and emperors. This power also had its own days to honour the dead. It had its own gods of the harvest. And soon, very soon, the long, straight roads of Rome would cut through these ancient, misty forests, and the Roman soldier would stand face to face with the masked ghost of Samhain. The world was about to change. The hard, hobnailed sandals of the legions marched on to the damp earth, and the sound was a stark, repeating rhythm against the ancient soft silence of the Celtic lands. The Roman roads, impossibly straight, cut through the winding secret paths of the forest. It was a meeting of worlds. Iron met mist. Order met magic. The Roman standard, the eagle of Jupiter, was planted in the same soil that held the sacred, hidden groves of the Druids. And as the empire expanded, as it absorbed these new wild territories of Britain and Gaul, it did what it always did. It did not just conquer, it observed, it catalogued, and it absorbed. The Roman mind was, above all, a practical one. When the soldiers and governors stationed in these new, damp, foggy outposts witnessed the turning of the season, they saw the locals preparing for Samhain. They saw the great bonfires. They saw the strange, masked figures moving through the villages, they saw the offerings of food and drink left out in the cold, and they did not perhaps understand the terror of the thinned veil or the specific names of the Aussie, but they recognized the pattern. They were, after all, a people of 1,000 gods and 100 festivals. They understood the importance of marking the end of the harvest, and they certainly understood the need to appease the spirits of the dead. In the Roman calendar, this same time of year, the cusp of autumn and winter, was also a time of gratitude. As the Celts looked to their final grain harvest, the Romans looked to their orchards. They had a goddess, a quiet, gentle deity named Pomona. She was not a goddess of war or the sky. She was the goddess of fruit trees, of nuts, of the heavy, bending bough. Her name came from the word pomum, the fruit. Her festival was a simple, rustic celebration of the final, sweet bounty of the earth before the cold set in. It was a time of thanking the orchards, of enjoying the apples, the pears, and the walnuts that would sustain them through the winter. And so, a Roman soldier, watching the Celtic children play their divination games on Samhain, might have seen something wonderfully familiar. He would see them peeling an apple, trying to form an initial with the long, unbroken skin. He would see them roasting nuts in the fire, their fate told by which one popped or hissed. And he would not think of the Druid's moon. He would smile, and he would think, Pomona. In his mind, the two celebrations were one and the same. They were both about the harvest's end, about apples, about nuts, and about preparing for the dark. This is how the blending began, not as an order from an emperor, but in the kitchens, in the fields, in the shared marketplaces. A Roman settler, marrying a Celtic woman, would see her family prepare for Samhain. He would bring his own traditions to the hearth. In my home, he might say, we honour Pomona with the apples. And the apple, already a sacred symbol of knowledge and the otherworld to the Celts, became even more deeply embedded in the night's rituals. The games of divination with apples, the bobbing for them in troughs of water, these became a centerpiece of the celebration, a perfect seamless merger of two beliefs. The Celtic magic of the apple and the Roman gratitude for it became one and the same. Just as these two streams of history, the Roman and the Celtic, began to flow together to form a new, wider river, our own story continues to flow through the quiet of the night. If you are finding a strange comfort in this current, a sense of connection to these merged and mingled pasts, a gentle subscription is the small, quiet act that ensures our journey together doesn't end here. It ensures we will continue to meet to explore these echoes in the nights that are yet to come. And then there were the dead. The Romans also had their days to honour them. They had Feralia in February, a solemn time to visit the tombs of the ancestors and leave small gifts. And they had Lemuria in May, a night of primal fear. Very different from the respectful Feralia. This was a night to appease the lemures, the angry, wandering, restless spirits of those who had not been buried properly. On that night, the head of the household would walk barefoot through his house in the dark, clashing bronze pots and throwing black beans over his shoulder, chanting 9 times, "Ghosts of my fathers, depart." He was, in his own way, hiding. He was purifying his home, driving out the unwanted, just as the Celts, with their new hearth fires, were protecting theirs. So when the Romans saw the masked mummers, the guisers, they may not have seen proxies for the Aussie. They may have seen a living embodiment of the lemures, the wandering dead, the Celtic ritual of dressing as spirits, of hiding the human face, was a fascinating and terrifying solution to a problem the Romans understood perfectly. The two cultures, in their own ways, both acknowledged that on certain nights the dead held sway and mortals had to be careful. The Roman, in his practicality, may have even adopted the custom, finding it a more theatrical way of dealing with the spirits than just throwing beans. And so the festival began to change. It was a slow, quiet, unconscious synthesis. Over generations, the deep primal terror of Samhain began to soften, tempered by the Roman sense of festive gratitude. It was still a night of spirits, but it was now also a night of apples. The bonfires still burned, but perhaps the offerings now included a bit of Roman wine alongside the Celtic ale. The masks were still worn, but they became less about a terrifying camouflage and more about a playful, ritualized guising. The mist of the Druids was slowly mingling with the smoke of the Roman hearth. The festival was becoming something new, a hybrid child of two great civilizations. But this too was not its final form. The Roman Empire itself, the marble and the iron, was already facing its own twilight. Another power, one born in the deserts of Judea, was spreading along those same straight roads. This new faith had its own calendar, its own saints, and its own profound ideas about the dead, and it would soon cast its own long shadow over this ancient hybrid night. The light of the Roman eagle faded. The legions, once the masters of the known world, retreated. Their straight roads began to crack, their marble temples to crumble. And into this twilight of empire, a new story emerged, a new faith that had travelled along those very same roads. It was a story whispered in candle-lit chapels and proclaimed from the steps of new basilicas. It spoke not of a pantheon of gods, but of one God. It spoke not of the ARC and the mounds, but of angels and demons. It spoke of saints. This new faith, Christianity, spread with a quiet, persistent power, and it cast a long shadow, the shadow of the cross, over the ancient festivals of Europe. The church, as it grew, encountered these old stubborn traditions. It found the bonfires of Samhain, the masked processions, the offerings left for the spirits, the apples of Pomona, and it saw them as a problem. These were not mere harvest festivals. In the eyes of the new priests, these were rituals of darkness. They were a communion with the pagan past, with the world of shadow and superstition that the church had come to illuminate. The thinning of the veil was not a time for ancestors, but a time when demons roamed free. The Druids' moon was no longer a sacred lamp. It was a relic of a time before the true light. And the church knew that it could not simply forbid these things. They were too deep. They were tied to the land, to the harvest, to the turning of the year, and to the profound human need to remember the dead. To cut them out entirely would be to wound the people. And so, the church, in its ancient wisdom, chose a different path. It was a path of conversion, not just of people, but of the days themselves. If the people insisted on gathering at the beginning of winter to honour the supernatural, then the church would give them something holy to honour. If they insisted on acknowledging the dead, then the church would teach them the correct way to do so. It was a slow, brilliant act of spiritual alchemy, of laying a new sanctified cloth over an old, wild table. In the 8th century, Pope Gregory III consecrated a chapel in St. Peter's Basilica to all the saints, and he fixed its anniversary on November 1st. This was a day for all the Hallows, the holy ones, the saints who sat in heaven. It was a powerful, positive celebration, a day to look up to the light, not down into the misty graves. This was the first stroke. The wild, chaotic energy of Samhain was now bracketed, given a new holy purpose. The day itself was claimed. But what of the night before? What of October 31st? It could no longer be just Samhain. It became the vigil for the new great feast. It was All Hallows Eve, the eve or evening before the day of All Hallows. The name itself was a kind of taming. It domesticated the night, turning it from a time of primal fear into a night of solemn preparation and prayer before a sacred day. But the church was not done. The new feast of All Saints' Day honoured the perfected heavenly souls. It did not fully satisfy the people's need to connect with their own dead, the mother, the father, the child who had passed, the souls who were not saints but were still beloved. And so, a century or so later, another tradition took root, spreading from the great monasteries. November the 2nd was designated as All Souls' Day. This was a day of prayer for all the Christian dead, especially for the souls believed to be in purgatory, a place of purification, waiting to enter heaven. This was the masterstroke. It captured the very heart of Samhain, the connection to the ancestors, and reframed it entirely. Now, the old traditions could be seamlessly absorbed. The great bonfires, they were no longer lit to ward off the ALC. They were now soul flames, lit to represent the light of Christ, or perhaps to light the way for the souls in purgatory, a comfort to them in their journey. The offering of food, left on the doorstep, it was no longer a tax to the wandering spirits. It was now a charitable act, an offering of food given to the poor, in exchange for which the poor would pray for the souls of the families dead. The act of remembrance was now an act of prayer. The masked guisers, the strange, anonymous figures who had once hidden from the spirits, their role too began to change. They were no longer just echoes of the forest. They were becoming something new. They were becoming the living, walking representatives of the dead souls they were praying for. They were becoming the soulers, and their quiet, shuffling procession from door to door, once a silent ritual of appeasement, was about to find its voice. And so, the night found its new voice. It was no longer the silent, terrifying ritual of the wooden mask. It was no longer the roar of the druid's bonfire. Instead, it was a sound that was small and human and sharp with the cold. Imagine a dark village lane somewhere in medieval England or Ireland. The stone church is a black shape against a sky of cold stars, and the bell has long since tolled for vespers. The air smells of frost and faintly of wood smoke and baking. From the darkness, a small light appears, the fragile dancing glow of a single lantern held aloft by a small cold hand. Behind it, figures move, wrapped in dark, heavy wool, their faces not hidden by monstrous masks but smudged with soot, or simply left bare to the wind, raw and red. These are the soulers. They are the poor of the parish, the children, the widows, the people who lived on the margins. On this one night, All Hallows Eve, they are given a sacred purpose. They are no longer just begging for themselves, they are walking for the dead. They move from cottage to cottage, their feet shuffling on the frozen mud. They stop before a door, where a sliver of warm light escapes from beneath. They stand there, a small, huddled group, and then the silence is broken. They begin to sing. It is the souler's cry. Their voices are thin, reedy, and haunting, a simple, repetitive chant that cuts through the night. A soul cake, a soul cake. Have mercy on all Christian souls for a soul cake. Inside, the family is waiting. They have heard the song. The woman of the house moves from the hearth, where a special batch of baking has been set aside. She carries a tray of soul cakes. These are not grand confections. They are small, simple, round buns, perhaps dense and heavy, flavoured with the precious spices of nutmeg or cinnamon. They are marked, always, with a simple cross, etched into the dough before baking. The cross is a sign. This is not mere food. This is an act of Christian charity, an alms. The door creaks open, and the warm, bright light of the hearth spills out, illuminating the faces of the solars. Their eyes are wide, their breath pluming in the air. This was the new profound bargain of the night. It was a trade, a sacred contract. The lady of the house hands a cake to each person. For every cake given, the solars promise to say a prayer for this family's dead. We will pray for your father, they might say. We will pray for the soul of your child. It was a simple, beautiful, and deeply comforting exchange. The wealthy, or even the moderately well off, could not pray their own dead out of purgatory, but they could offer charity, and the poor, who had nothing else to give, could offer the power of their prayers. Each simple cake, it was believed, was a prayer received, a small bit of comfort, a measure of relief for a soul lingering in the shadowy, waiting world. This ritual, souling, was a perfect solution. It tamed the night, the wild, chaotic, and terrifying energy of Samhain with its border-crossing spirits and monstrous masks was gone. It had been replaced by a solemn, predictable, and pious Christian ritual. The fear of the AOC had been replaced by the theological concern for purgatory. The anonymous, threatening geyser who took an offering on behalf of the spirits was replaced by the known local poor who accepted a gift and offered a prayer in return. The community was strengthened, the wealthy fulfilled their duty of charity, and the poor were given both food and a vital spiritual role. The entire act was wrapped in the sanctity of the church. And yet, the bones of the old night were still there, lying just beneath the surface. The deep, ancient memory of the night was not so easily erased. Was this act of going door to door, in the dark, on the one night of the year when the veil was thin, so different from the masked mummers of the Druids? Was the gift of a soul cake, given at the threshold, so different from the offering of grain and nuts left for the RC? The reason had been rewritten, the names had been changed, the cross had been carved into the cake. But the form was ancient. The form was a powerful echo. It was Samhain, dressed in a monk's robe. This tradition of souling would settle, deep and comfortable, across the British Isles, a beloved part of All Hallows Eve, for hundreds of years. But the world was growing larger. Great, tall-masted ships were beginning to cross the dark, seemingly endless ocean, and they carried with them not just people and cargo, but their memories, their fears, and their old, old traditions. The solar's cry and the flicker of their lantern was about to be carried into a vast, new, and unknown wilderness. The dark ocean was vast, and the crossing was long. The ships that cut through the black, heaving waves were worlds unto themselves, cramped and fragile, filled with the hopeful and the desperate. They carried their meagre physical possessions, a wooden chest, a set of tools, a few heavy wool blankets. But they also carried an invisible cargo. They carried the memory of the hills they had left. They carried the tunes of old songs, the taste of their mother's bread, and the flickering, fragile light of their traditions. And among those traditions, packed away in the corners of their minds, was the memory of All Hallows Eve. The solar's cry, the scent of the soul cakes, the feel of the autumn mist. These things came with them across the salt and the spray. But the light of that tradition, the lantern of the solar, it faltered on the journey. It was a faint and gentle flame born of an ancient layered world of druids, Romans, and monks, and the world it was heading toward was a new world, a hard world, a world that had little patience for shadows or for the delicate moss-grown rituals of the past. When these immigrants, the English, the Scottish, the Irish, first set foot on the shores of America, they did not find the cosy, compact villages they had left behind. They found a continent that was a vast, raw, and profound wilderness. The forests were not the familiar managed woods of home, they were deep, dark, and truly unknown. The enemy here was not the unseen Our Sea, but the real physical dangers of starvation, of the biting winter, of the unyielding land itself, and in many of the first colonies, especially in the iron-grey pious settlements of New England, the old ways were met with a new cold severity. The Puritans, who had left England to escape what they saw as the lingering, incense-choked superstitions of the Church, had no tolerance for such things. To them, All Hallows Eve was worse than meaningless. It was a popish, Catholic invention, a celebration of saints and purgatory, things they had utterly rejected. And if it wasn't Catholic, it was something even worse. It was pagan. It was a night of mummery, of idolatry, of the devil's work. They had come to this new land to build a city on a hill, a beacon of pure, hard, scriptural light. There was no room, in their world, for the lantern of the solar, and so the tradition, the lantern's light, it seemed to go out. The night of October 31st became, for a time, just another night. It was the end of the harvest, yes, but that was a time for practical work, for salting the meat, for securing the cabins against the coming snows. It was not a time for masks, or for songs, or for walking from door to door. The belief in purgatory faded in this predominantly Protestant land, and with it, the entire logic of souling. Why ask for prayers for the dead, when the dead went straight to their final judgment? The soul cake, marked with its cross, was forgotten. The masked geyser, the echo of the forest spirit, was a sight that would have brought suspicion, not charity. The veil, it seemed, had been sewn shut, not by priests but by pragmatism, but a thing so old, so tied to the turning of the earth and the beating of the human heart, does not die so easily. It did not flourish in the tidy, watchful towns of the coast, but it slept. It found refuge in the folds of the land, in the isolated hollows, and the deep, misty valleys of the Appalachian Mountains. Here, the Scots-Irish, a people of stubborn memory and ancient ballads, settled far from the gaze of the preachers. They were a people who still believed in omens, who saw signs in the flight of birds, who knew the old stories. They may not have baked soul cakes, but they remembered the feeling of the night. They kept the harvest traditions. They kept the divination. On that last night of October, a young woman might still go to a stream or a mirror in the dark, hoping to see the face of her future husband. They kept the games with the apples. The legacy of Pomona, it seemed, was stronger than the memory of the saints, and they kept the stories. Oh, they kept the stories. This new, vast, dark continent was a perfect place for them. The deep, silent woods, the sighing wind in the pines, the sudden, strange cries in the night. This was a land made for ghosts. The old European tales found a new, frightening resonance here. The old fears found new soil. The lantern of the solar may have gone out, but the darkness it was meant to hold at bay, that darkness felt deeper than ever. The tradition was not dead. It was dormant. It was a seed, buried in the cold, hard ground of the New World, waiting. It waited for a new generation. It waited for a new wave of people, a great desperate flood of them who would bring the old magic back, not as a faint memory, but as a burning, starving, defiant part of their very soul. The flood came. It came not as a gentle, hopeful tide, but as a desperate, breaking wave of humanity. A great and terrible hunger had fallen upon the green fields of Ireland. The land itself, the very earth that had given life, turned betrayer. The potato, the humble root that was the bread and water of millions, blackened in the ground, dissolving into a foul, dark rot. It was Angorta More, the great hunger, and so they came, fleeing a land that had become a graveyard. They poured into the ports of America in the 1840s and 50s, not like the earlier pragmatic settlers, but as refugees. They came in what were called coffin ships, packed into dark, airless holds, hollow-eyed, sick, and starving. They had nothing. Nothing, that is, except the fierce, stubborn memory of who they were. Unlike the Puritans who had sewn the veil shut, these new arrivals were overwhelmingly Catholic, and they held fast to the old ways with a desperate, defiant grip. Their traditions were not just gentle memories, they were a shield. They were an identity. In a new fast-paced Protestant land that was often hostile to them, that labelled them as ignorant and superstitious, their beliefs became a form of resistance. And they brought All Hallows Eve back, not as the quiet, prayerful souling of the English, but as something far more wild, more primal, and more fun. They brought back the magic, they brought back the mischief, and they brought back the light. They too believed in the thinned veil. But their spirit world was not just of saints and purgatory. It was the older, wilder world. It was the world of the puxa, the mischievous, shape-shifting horse spirit that would trick lonely travellers, and the keening, terrifying banshee whose wail foretold a death in the family. These were not spirits you prayed for. These were spirits you avoided. And to walk on their night, you needed protection. You needed a disguise, and you needed a light. The old tradition of guising was reborn, but it was the light that would change everything. Back in Ireland, they did not have the solar's simple lantern. They had something far stranger, something with a story. On All Hallows Eve, the village men would take a large humble turnip or a mangold, which is a kind of large tough beet. They would sit by the fire, and with a small sharp blade they would work and work and work. It was a difficult, laborious task to hollow out that dense woody flesh, but they would persist, scraping it raw until it was a hollow shell. Then into the side they would carve a face. It was not a happy face. It was a crude, grimacing, often frightening visage, meant to ward off the very spirits it represented. And inside, they would not place a candle. They would place a single hot, glowing coal, scooped carefully from the embers of the hearth. This, they said, was the light of Jack, Jack of the lantern, Jack-o'-lantern. The story, told as the wind howled outside, was of an old, miserly and clever trickster named, of course, Jack. Jack was so stingy with his money and his soul that he was known throughout the countryside. One night, the devil himself, having heard of his black reputation, came to claim his due. But Jack, quick-witted, tricked the devil, perhaps by trapping him in a tree, by carving a cross on the trunk. He would not let him down until the devil promised to never take his soul. The devil, furious but bound by his own rules, agreed. Years passed, and Jack lived his miserly life until he finally died. He went up to the gates of heaven, but saint. Peter looked at his long, selfish record and turned him away. "There is no place for you here," he said. So Jack, with nowhere else to go, went down to the gates of hell. The devil saw him coming, and he laughed a cold, dry laugh. "I cannot take you, Jack," he sneered. "You remember our bargain?" "But where am I to go?" Jack cried, his soul now cold and terrified, shivering in the great formless void between the worlds. "I am in the dark." The devil, perhaps with a spark of mocking pity, or perhaps as a final cruel joke, reached into the flames of hell and scooped out a single eternally burning coal. He tossed it to the spirit of Jack. "Here," he said, "this will light your way. Now go. Walk the dark between the worlds, forever." And so, the legend concluded, Jack caught the coal. He'd been eating a raw turnip when he died, and he hollowed it out, placed the infernal ember inside, and he has been walking ever since. A lost, damned soul, with his terrible glowing turnip, a beacon for all other lost spirits, seen only on All Hallows Eve. The Irish immigrants carried this story and this tradition to America. They carried the memory of that grimacing, glowing turnip. But when they arrived in this new vast and fertile land, they found that woody turnips were not as common as they had been back home. They found something else. Growing in the fields, a native fruit of this new continent was a great round orange gourd. The pumpkin. It was larger. It was softer. It was already mostly hollow. It was perfect. It was as if the land itself was offering them a better vessel for their ghost. And so the tradition transformed. The difficult, pained, small face of the woody turnip was replaced. Now, with the pumpkin, the faces could be large. They could be elaborate. They could be howling, or laughing, or terrifying. The light inside was no longer a single dangerous coal, but a candle, which cast a brighter, more stable, more magnificent glow. The jack-o'-lantern was reborn, an American icon with an ancient Irish soul. This glowing orange face set on the doorstep became the symbol of the night. It was the old magic, given a new, brighter, bolder form. It was the guardian of the threshold, the spirit of the harvest, and the true king of this new, evolving American night. The new nation was itself a kind of hollow. It was a land of vast shadowed valleys and deep quiet forests that held their breath. The ink was still drying on the maps, and the memory of the recent, bloody war was a fresh wound, a new layer of ghosts laid over the ancient native spirits of the land. The country was looking for its own stories. The old tales of the Aussie and the Pusa were carried in the hearts of the immigrants, but the land itself, the land was birthing new legends, and it found its first great storyteller in a man named Washington Irving. He was an observer, a dreamer, a man who walked the misty banks of the Hudson River and listened to the old Dutch ghost stories that clung to the air like fog. He wrote of a particular place, a small drowsy valley he called Sleepy Hollow. It was, he wrote, a place bewitched, a place where the air itself was different, filled with a drowsy, dreamy influence. It was a pocket of the old world, a place where time had slowed down, where the people, the descendants of the old Dutch settlers, were prone to superstition. They saw signs in the clouds. They heard voices in the wind. And they all knew, with a certainty as solid as the trees, that the valley was haunted. It was haunted not by an ancient formless spirit, but by something new, something American. It was the ghost of a Hessian soldier, a mercenary who had fought for the British and whose head had been famously carried off by a cannonball in some long-forgotten battle. And so, this spectre, this headless horseman, was said to ride forth. He rode on the blackest nights, a frantic, furious, and headless shadow, forever searching for the head he had lost. He was a hunter, a pursuer. He was the embodiment of the new, violent, and restless past of the continent. Into this valley, this cauldron of superstition, Irving placed his hero, or perhaps his fool, Ichabod Crane, a lanky, awkward, and deeply superstitious schoolmaster, a man greedy for food and for stories of the supernatural. He was a man who devoured the old, frightening tales, and one night he would become one. Imagine him riding his slow, clumsy horse, gunpowder through the deepening dark. He is coming from a party, his mind a jumble of the harvest feast, the pretty heiress Katrina Van Tassel, and the ghost stories that had been told around the fire. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, every rustle in the bushes makes his blood run cold. He is the perfect vessel for the fear of the night. He reaches the bridge over the stream, the very bridge, the story said, where the horseman was most powerful, the threshold the ghost could not cross. And it is there in the oppressive deep shadow that he sees it, a massive dark shape, a horseman impossibly large, outlined against the sky, and the figure, as it turns, has no head. There is only the collar of the coat. The chase begins. Ichabod, in a blind panic, whips his poor horse, his heart a hammer in his chest. The horseman is silent, a dreadful thundering presence behind him. Ichabod remembers the stories. If he can just reach the other bridge, the one by the old church, he will be safe. He sees it. He crosses it. He looks back, expecting his pursuer to vanish in a flash of brimstone. But the horseman does not vanish. He stops. He stands in his stirrups, and he hurls his head at the schoolmaster. Ichabod sees it coming, a terrible round missile. It strikes him, and he tumbles, senseless from his horse, into the dust. The next morning, there is no sign of Ichabod Crane. He has vanished from the valley forever. All that is left by the side of the bridge is his hat, and lying beside it, shattered into a dozen pieces, is a large orange pumpkin. In that one perfect, terrifying image, Washington Irving captured the spirit of the age. Was it a real ghost? Or was it a prank, a clever, cruel trick by Ichabod's rival, Brom Bones, who knew the man's superstitious nature and used it against him? The story never truly says, and in that ambiguity, its power lies. But what it did was take the humble, glowing pumpkin of the Irish immigrant, the lantern of stingy Jack, and fuse it forever with a terrifying American ghost. The pumpkin was no longer just a light to ward off spirits. It was now the very head of a spirit. It was a weapon of the dark. It was the symbol of the haunting itself. Irving's tale, published in 1820, became a sensation. It was the first true great American ghost story, and it placed the pumpkin at the very centre of its mythology. The night was no longer just about the dead, or the saints, or the mischief. It was now, truly, a night to be haunted. This story confirmed what the thinning of the veil had always suggested. The spirits were here. They were in the hollows. And if they were in the hollows, perhaps they were in the homes too. Perhaps, in this new age of science and curiosity, one could even invite them in. The ghosts were no longer just a story told around a fire. They were no longer the thundering, headless phantom of the hollow, a thing to be fled from in the dark. As the 19th century deepened, as the world filled with the smoke of industry and the sharp, clicking sound of the telegraph, a new, strange longing emerged. It was an age of impossible progress, of iron horses that crossed continents and cables that whispered beneath the sea, and yet this progress had come at a cost. The world felt louder, harder, and faster, and death, in this new age, felt colder and more final. The old simple face was, for many, no longer enough. They wanted proof. This desire was sharpened, turned into a desperate collective cry by the terrible blade of war. The American Civil War carved the nation in two, and it left a wound that was not just on the land, B.A. in the heart. Hundreds of thousands of young men were gone, vanishing into the smoke of cannons and the unmarked muddy graves of distant battlefields. They had died without a last word, without a hand to hold. And the grief was a vast, heavy, and unlifted fog. People were desperate. They did not just want to pray for their dead, they wanted to talk to them. They wanted to know they were safe. They wanted to say goodbye. And so they invited the ghosts indoors. This was the birth of the Victorian seance. They turned away from the bright, gaslit, rational world. They drew the heavy velvet curtains, blocking out the light, blocking out the sound of the city. They gathered in the quiet of the parlour around a heavy polished mahogany table. This was a new altar. They would sit, a small circle of them, their hands spread, their fingertips just touching, bridging the small gaps between them. The only sound was the ticking of the clock, the creak of the old house, the sharp intake of breath. The air would grow thick, heavy with expectation. At the head of the table sat the new priestess, the medium. She was the new gateway, the living bridge across the veil. Where the druid had once stood by the bonfire, she now sat in the dark, her eyes closed. They would wait, and then a sound. A single, hard, sudden rap. A knock, seeming to come from inside the wood of the table itself. A collective gasp. The medium, her voice a low whisper, would begin. Is there a spirit present? Rap, rap, rap. 3 raps. Yes. The connection was made. The veil had been breached. This was not the chaotic, primal thinning of Samhain. This was a controlled breach. It was done by invitation. They used codes, alphabets, slates with chalk, and tilting tables to spell out messages. They were not hiding from the spirits. They were interviewing them. And on what night, do you suppose, was this connection thought to be the strongest? On what night was the air most conductive to the voices of the beyond? It was, of course, the old night, All Hallows Eve. The ancient folk memory of Samhain, the night the veil was at its thinnest, made it the high, holy night of the spiritualist movement. This changed the very nature of the haunting. The ghosts of Halloween were no longer the ancient, fearsome Aos Sea or the terrifying headless Hessian. They were family. They were little Mary, lost to the fever. They were Brother Thomas, who had fallen at Gettysburg. They were, they hoped, the comforting presence of a mother or a father, sending a message from the Summerland, their name for the afterlife. The night was becoming internalized. The spirits were no longer a threat out there. They were a comfort in here. They were at the table. They were part of the home. Was it real? Was it the house settling or the wood warping? Was it the clever unseen work of a medium, skilled in the art of deception, tapping the table with a hidden foot? Or was it truly a voice, a whisper, a touch from a world just beyond the curtain? For the grieving Victorians sitting in that dark, hopeful room, the answer did not always matter. The comfort was real. The hope was real. But this new tradition, this heavy, solemn, parlour-bound ritual, it was a thing of adults. It was a night of hushed voices, of tears, and of intense sombre quiet. The children perhaps listened at the keyhole, their eyes wide. This was their night too, and they would not be content to sit in the dark waiting for a table to knock. The spirits were invited in, yes, but the children, sensing the chaos that this night always promised, were about to let all the other spirits, the spirits of pure mischief, out. The adults sat in the dark, hushed and waiting, their fingers touching on the polished wood, straining to hear a whisper from the summerland. They were seeking a refined, gentle connection to the dead, a confirmation, a comfort. The air in the parlour was thick, still, and heavy with intention. But just outside the heavy velvet curtains, beyond the glass, a different kind of spirit was stirring. It was not a whisper. It was a laugh, sharp and sudden in the cold. It was the sound of running feet on the new wooden sidewalks. The seance had invited the dead in, but in doing so, it had left the night outside completely, wonderfully, and terribly unattended. And the children, the young, they were the inheritors of that wild, unattended dark. This was the other Halloween. While the parents sat in solemnity, the youth of the towns and cities were reclaiming the night in a way their Celtic ancestors would have perhaps recognized. The old primal memory of Samhain, the time outside of time, the night when the rules of the world were suspended, had not died. It had not been prayed away by the monks or civilized by the apple games of Pomona. It had simply gone underground, and now it burst forth not as a religious ritual, but as a catharsis. It was the night of mischief. The gates, both literal and metaphorical, were truly loosed. Imagine a respectable American town in the late 1800s. The gas lamps cast pools of weak yellow light. The houses are tidy, their front yards guarded by proud, newly painted picket fences and gates. All is order, all is propriety. Then the sun goes down on October 31st, and the town, for just a few hours, descends into a joyous, unsettling chaos. The spirits of the Sea, the ancient tricksters, were reborn, and they wore the faces of the town's own sons. The air would fill with shouts, with the crash of metal, the splintering of wood. The respectable citizen, waking on November 1st, would step outside his home and find his world turned upside down. His front gate was gone, simply vanished. He would find it, perhaps 3 streets over, hanging from a lamppost, or in a show of ambitious collective effort, it might be found on the roof of the church bell tower. The farmer coming to his wagon would find it completely disassembled, every wheel, every board, and every spoke, and meticulously reassembled, impossibly, on the peak of his barn roof. The shopkeeper would find his sign, General Mercantile, now hanging proudly above the door of the town's austere bank, while the banker's sign was now affixed to the local saloon. It was a world remade by jesters. And there were the smaller, more personal invasions. The windows, a bar of soap, dragged across the glass, left greasy, opaque streaks, blurring the outside world, or worse, the tic-tac, a simple spool of thread, notched and wound with string, which, when pressed against a window pane and pulled, would create a horrible, rattling, scraping sound. It sounded, for all the world, like a skeletal finger or a monstrous claw trying to get in. It was the sound of the seance, but it was a joke, a terrifying, heart-stopping joke. And then, the most infamous of all, the outhouse. The small wooden structures, symbols of rustic necessity, were the prime targets. A hard, coordinated shove by a group of laughing, anonymous boys, and the structure would topple, a victim of the night's misrule. How did they do this? Why? By becoming the masks of the forgotten once more. They were not Henry or Thomas or James. They were spirits. They were guisers. They wore crude, terrifying masks made of paper bags or painted cloth. They blackened their faces with soot from the chimney, erasing their features, becoming creatures of shadow. This was the ancient magic of the Samhain traveller reborn. In this anonymity, they were free. They were not the banker's son or the blacksmith's apprentice. They were the spirit of Halloween itself. They were the poocher, the trickster, given human form. They were the tangible embodiment of the night's chaos. This was, in its way, a necessary release. In an age that was becoming increasingly rigid, industrial, and structured, the night of mischief was a social safety valve. It was the one night of the year when the wild animal spirits of the young were allowed to break the bonds of propriety. It was a night when the world was inverted, when the boys were in charge and the adults were the victims. It was a war of a kind, a ritualized, mostly harmless war between order and chaos, but mostly is a fragile word. As the century turned, as the towns grew into cities, the mischief began to lose its playful edge. The pranks became destructive. They bordered on vandalism. It was no longer just a gate on a roof. It was a fire hydrant opened, flooding a street. It was real, malicious damage. The police reports from Halloween in the 1920s and 30s tell a story of a night spiralling out of control. The towns, the adults, the very people who had once perhaps taken part in the fun, they were growing tired. The chaos was becoming too chaotic. The gates had been loosed too far. The wild ancient spirit of the night had been let out, and now they had to find a way to tame it. They had to find a way to appease these young destructive spirits. They needed to transform this wild geyser's dance into something else, something safer, something for the children. The fire of the prank had burned too hot. The night of misrule, that wild, chaotic echo of Samhain, had become a genuine, costly and frightening problem. The laughter of the soot-faced boys had taken on a harder, more destructive edge. As the towns grew, the pranks became less about communal jesters and more about anonymous, urban vandalism. The social fabric itself felt strained, and the night of mischief was a thread that was pulling it apart. The adults, the civic leaders, the police, they knew that simple force, that arresting the shadows, would not work. The spirit of the night was too strong. You could not kill it. But perhaps you could domesticate it. You could teach the wild spirit a new, more gentle dance. You see, the guising, the act of dressing up, had split into two very different paths. For the older boys, the youths, the mask was a tool of anonymity, a shield that allowed them to commit their pranks, to become the trickster spirit. It was an act of hiding, of war. But there was another, much older memory of guising, one that had travelled with the Scots and the Irish, a memory that had been largely dormant. This was the memory of souling, the memory of the performer. In this tradition, the costume was not for hiding. It was for showing. It was a performance. It was a dance. This older tradition was seized upon by the community. It was a conscious choice. In the 1920s and 30s, as the vandalism reached its peak, towns and cities all over America began to fight back, not with police, but with parties. They decided to co-opt the night, Schools, churches, and community centres opened their doors. They organised Halloween festivals. They held costume parades. They offered prizes for the best, the funniest, the scariest. They filled the evening with organised games, with apple bobbing, the old ghost of Pomona, and with donuts and cider. They sought to give the youth something to do, a place to be that was not out in the dark, unsupervised, with a bar of soap or a can of paint. And this began to change the very nature of the costume. The crude, terrifying homemade masks of the mischief maker, the paper bag with punched out eyes, the face smeared with ash. That was the uniform of the vandal. But the costume for the parade, for the party, that was something different. That was about imagination. That was about creativity. It was about being seen, not hiding. And so, the children, the younger children, were brought into the ritual. The night was slowly taken from the adolescents and given to the little ones. The geysers' dance was changing. The wild, leaping, destructive run of the teenage pack was being replaced by the small, shuffling, excited steps of a child. And the costume changed with them. It was no longer about being a spirit. It was about being a thing, a specific thing. A ghost, yes, but a harmless white-sheeted ghost. A witch, but a storybook witch with a pointy hat. Not the old feared crone, a black cat, a skeleton. And with the rise of the new magic of cinema, they became the monsters they saw on the screen. Dracula, the mummy, the wolfman. The guising had become a game. And this new, tamed children's game began to leave the community centre. The parents, now encouraged, would walk their costume children down the street to show them off to the neighbours. Look what a wonderful ghost he makes. The ritual of walking from house to house, which had once been the domain of the destructive, was now being reclaimed by the innocent. The old frightening procession of the masked geysers was being reborn as a children's parade. And a new unspoken bargain began to form at the threshold. The homeowner, who a few years before would have shuttered his windows and dreaded the knock on the door, now heard a different kind of knock. He would open it, and on his step, he would not see a menacing, anonymous figure. He would see his neighbour's children, dressed as a princess or a pirate or a hobo. They were small. They were known. They were harmless. They were performing. They were playing the game. And what do you do when a child comes to your door in costume playing a game? You give them a reward. You applaud the performance. You give them a treat, an apple, a handful of nuts, a homemade cookie. This was the new appeasement. It was the ancient ritual of Samhain in its newest, most civilized form. The homeowner, by giving a small offering, was no longer buying protection from the AOC, the angry spirits of the other world. He was buying protection from the older boys. He was participating in the community-wide effort to keep the night peaceful. By rewarding the game, he was helping to kill the mischief. The treat was a payment, a small, sweet tax to ensure the peace. The ritual was now in place. The costumes were there. The door-to-door procession was there. The offering was there. All that was missing were the words, the official spoken command. The three simple words that would turn this new, unspoken bargain into the most famous ritual of the modern night. The bargain was unspoken, but it hung in the air, as crisp and clear as the October night. The homeowner would open the door, not with the dread of a few years prior, but with a new strange sense of duty. On the doorstep stood a small sheeted ghost, or a princess with a tinfoil crown. They were harmless. They were the children of the neighbourhood. But behind them, unseen, down the street, In the shadows by the alley lingered the other spirit of the night, the spirit of mischief, the threat of the soaped window, the toppled outhouse, the missing gate. The homeowner looked at the small child and saw a proxy, an ambassador from the forces of chaos. And the offering, the apple, the small homemade popcorn ball, the penny, it was a tribute, a small sweet bribe paid to the idea of the night to keep the real destructive magic at bay. This ritual was powerful. It was a perfect communal piece of social engineering. But it was silent. It lacked a voice. The child would perhaps shuffle their feet. They might say Halloween, or just stand there, holding a bag open, an expectant costumed messenger. The ancient soulers had their cry, a soul cake, a soul cake. But these new modern spirits, these performers in the great town-wide play, they had no lines. The transaction was missing its incantation. It needed its own spell, a set of words that would unlock the door, acknowledge the bargain, and complete the exchange. And so the words came. They did not come from a proclamation or a book or a movie. They bubbled up from the streets themselves, from the mouths of the children who were living this new reality. It started, historians believe, somewhere in the American West, perhaps in the 1920s, a faint whisper. It was a phrase so blunt, so purely transactional, that it could only have been born in this new, practical world. It was a phrase that laid the ancient, unspoken bargain of Samhain bare, with all the subtlety of a thrown brick. A child, dressed as a hobo, would knock on the door, hold out their sack, and state the terms clear as a bell: trick or treat. It was not a question. It was a choice. It was the entire night, the entire history distilled into 3 words. Trick was the acknowledgement of the mischief, the vandalism, the chaos, the prank that the older boys were, at that very moment, perhaps planning. Treat was the offering, the appeasement, the apple, the cake, the coin. The phrase was a miniature verbal contract. It meant, give me the offering, and I, as the ambassador of this night, will guarantee your peace. But if you refuse, if you break this social compact, then you have chosen the other path. You have chosen the trick, and you would have only yourself to blame when you woke up to find your car tires deflated or your gate hanging from the telephone pole. This phrase, this magical, threatening, perfect phrase, was born in the heart of the Great Depression. This was not a time of abundance. A treat, a piece of fruit, a cookie, a small square of fudge was a genuine, precious commodity. Sugar was a luxury, and a trick, a broken fence, a flooded yard, was a disaster, an expense that a family already struggling simply could not bear. So when a small, costumed child stood at your door and presented this stark economic choice, it was not taken lightly. It was a serious, ritualized negotiation. The child was given a sudden, strange power, the power of the ancient geyser. The words were a perfect success. They were catchy. They were clear. They were a script. Children, who for a decade had been simply showing up in costume, now had their lines. They knew what to say. And the adults, who had been giving treats out of a vague sense of community spirit and fear, now knew exactly why they were doing it. The phrase spread like wildfire. Newspapers in the 1930s began to report on this new, peculiar, and somewhat charming form of youthful extortion. It was seen as the final taming act. The threat of the trick was still there, but it had been ritualized. It had been transferred from the destructive teenage vandal to the small, innocent child. The threat was now symbolic, a ghost of its former self. By saying trick or treat, the child was, in essence, performing a tiny play. They were playing the part of the mischievous spirit, but they were doing it in a safe, controlled, and adorable way. And the adult, by handing over the treat, was playing their part, the part of the appeasing villager. The ritual was complete. The night was finally, totally, and successfully domesticated. The mischief was contained. The wild, anonymous, destructive energy of the geyser was gone, replaced by the polite, scripted, and rewarded performance of the child. The night was now about the treats. The entire vast, chaotic energy of Halloween, from the druid's moon to the headless horseman, had been funneled, focused, and captured in a small, held-open cloth bag. The bargain was sealed. But this new, all-powerful ritual had just created a new, modern, and very powerful economy. The simple, homemade treat was about to face a revolution. The bargain was struck. The 3 words, trick or treat, had tamed the night, transforming a chaotic adolescent rampage into a polite, scripted performance by children. And the treat itself, it was the currency of this new peaceful kingdom. But in the beginning, in the 1930s and 40s, that currency was humble. It was personal. The door would open, and the woman of the house, who had perhaps spent the afternoon baking, would smile. She would drop into the held-open sack a small, lumpy, wax-paper-wrapped popcorn ball, still slightly warm, or a single shiny red apple, a direct living echo of Pomona's ancient feast. Perhaps it was a square of homemade fudge, or a few pennies. These were not grand gestures. They were small acts of neighbourly charity, a continuation of the soul cake's ancient spirit. The treat was an extension of the home itself, but the world was changing. It was changing faster than any druid or Roman could have ever imagined. The great, terrible war ended, and America plunged into a new era of dizzying, unprecedented prosperity, the 1950s. It was the age of the suburb. Families moved into new houses with manicured lawns, and neighbours they did not always know. The cosy, tight-knit village where the woman at the door had known the masked child's name was dissolving, replaced by a sprawling, anonymous landscape. And with this anonymity, a new, cold fear began to creep in. It was the fear of the stranger. The newspapers, those new, modern tellers of tales, began to whisper a new kind of ghost story. It was not a story of a headless horseman. It was a story of a poisoned treat, an apple so beautiful and red, with a razor blade hidden just beneath the skin, a piece of homemade candy, a sweet, innocent-looking thing, laced with something terrible. These stories, they were almost entirely myths, urban legends. Sociologists have searched, and in all of history the number of confirmed cases of a stranger truly poisoning a child's Halloween treat is virtually zero. But the fear was real. It was the perfect, modern bogeyman. It took the night's most sacred ritual, the offering, and turned it into a threat. The hand that gave the treat was no longer the hand of a neighbour. It was the hand of a potential monster. This was a crisis for the festival. The homemade treat, the symbol of community and trust, was now an object of profound suspicion. Parents, their hearts cold with this new modern terror, would wait for their children to return. They would dump the bags onto the kitchen table, and the old, loving ritual of sifting through the bounty became a new, anxious ritual of inspection. The popcorn ball was broken apart. The apple was sliced into a dozen pieces. The homemade fudge was viewed with distrust, and more often than not, thrown away. Just to be safe, the parents would say. The trust that held the old communal night together was broken, and so the night had to be saved. The ritual of trick or treat was too beloved to be abandoned. If the homemade personal treat was the problem, the solution must be something impersonal, something safe, something that could not be tamed, and the solution was waiting, gleaming on the brightly lit shelves of the new supermarkets. It was the commercially packaged, factory sealed, individually wrapped candy. This was the new magic. The seal was a promise. The wrapper was a shield. The brand name was a guarantee. A tiny chocolate bar, wrapped in foil and paper, was a symbol of industrial, anonymous safety. This was the sweet surrender. The candy companies, in a stroke of marketing genius, saw their moment. They began to produce their products for this night. They created the snack size, the fun size, small, perfect, identical units of sweetness designed to be purchased in massive bags and dropped one by one into the sacks of the costumed children. Halloween, which for centuries had been a folk ritual, a harvest festival, a night of homemade magic, was now suddenly a pillar of the national economy. It became a commercial juggernaut, a billion-dollar industry. The night was conquered not by the legions of Rome or the priests of the church, but by the barons of sugar. The ancient offerings were banished. The apple, the ghost of Pomona's harvest, was now looked upon with such suspicion that most children, seeing one in their bag, would simply throw it away. The nut, the tool of druidic divination, was a forgotten relic. The soul cake, the bread of charity, was a distant memory. The entire complex spiritual and communal meaning of the treat had been simplified, refined, and reduced to a single, powerful, glorious thing: sugar. The night was no longer about appeasing the dead, or the ALC, or even the teenage vandal. It was about acquisition. It was a hunt, a joyous, frantic, childish hunt for candy. The child would return home, not with a few simple personal tokens, but with a haul, a pillowcase, sagging under the weight of 100 branded, sealed, and safe victories. The ancient ritual of the harvest, of gathering the bounty for the winter, was reborn in its final, sweetest, and most modern form. The child triumphant sat on the floor, surrounded by this mountain of treasure, this hoard of sugar. The night was safe. The night was sweet. And the child, looking at their own face reflected in a piece of foil, was still, underneath it all, wearing a mask. The kingdom was secured. The candy, the sweet, safe, factory-sealed candy, had bought the peace. The ritual of trick-or-treat had successfully neutralized the chaos, turning a night of potential vandalism into a predictable, commercial, and child-friendly performance. The streets were orderly. The ancient, terrifying spirits of Samhain, the Aossi, the Pusha, the Headless Horseman, they had all been reduced to harmless, pint-sized ambassadors, their only demand a fun-sized chocolate bar. It would seem, then, that the magic was complete. The wild heart of the night had been finally and fully tamed. And yet the mask remained. The costume, the very heart of the guising, was more popular than ever. This is the quiet, lingering question of the modern night. If the goal is no longer to hide from spirits, and no longer to hide for the sake of mischief, and if the threat of the trick is now just a playful, symbolic echo, then why? Why do we still do it? Why, on this one safe, sweet night, does the child still want to paint their face like a skull? Why does the adult, taking them door to door, wear the rubber-smelling visage of a creature from a black lagoon? The treat explains the action, but it does not explain the face. The answer is a quiet one, but it is as deep as the druid's forest. The ancient primal power of the mask has not faded. It has simply changed its purpose. The original mask hid the wearer from the spirits of the other world. The modern mask, it hides the wearer from the rules of this one. It is a tool, not of survival, but of release. It is the power of anonymity. When the paint is applied, when the wig is settled, when the mask is pulled over the head, a small, thrilling and profound change occurs. The wearer's breath sounds different, echoing slightly in the hollow plastic. Their vision narrows, and their identity, the heavy, familiar, everyday identity, with all its rules, its anxieties, its job, its responsibilities, it is, for a few hours, lifted. You are no longer John, the accountant who worries about the mortgage. You are Dracula, the count who commands the night. You are no longer Sarah, the student, stressed about an exam. You are a witch, a creature of power and mystery. The painted face is a key, unlocking a door that is kept firmly, necessarily bolted for the other 364 days of the year. This power, this sweet temporary liberation, it was not just for the children. As the 20th century wore on, the adults began to watch. They saw the safe, sweet candy hunt that the night had become for their children. And they felt perhaps a small cold pang of jealousy. They remembered the mischief. They remembered the chaos. They remembered the wildness. The children had their ritual. The adults wanted theirs. And so, a new tradition was born, running in parallel to the children's, the adult Halloween party. This was the séance in reverse. The Victorians had sat in the dark, in their formal clothes, trying to call the spirits in. The modern adults put on the costumes, and they let their own spirits out. The adult party was the night of mischief, reborn. But it was an internalized mischief, a social mischief. The chaos was not directed at the town's property, but at its rigid social structure. Here, in the dim orange and black decorated living room, the mask was everything. It was permission. It was the great equalizer. The boss, dressed as a pirate, could no longer pull rank on the employee who was dressed as his boss. The shy, quiet neighbour, hidden behind the painted, smiling face of a clown, could be the loudest, most confident person in the room. The mask gave them permission. Permission to be loud, permission to be foolish, permission to be alluring. To be, for just one night, a different, bolder version of themselves. It was the ancient Celtic time outside of time, a brief magical bubble where the normal rules of the world were suspended. It was not a ritual of the dead, but a ritual of the living. It was a way for the modern, civilized, and highly regulated self to touch that older, wilder, more primal self that still lives, buried deep inside. This ancient power, the power of anonymity, was what the mask had always truly offered. The druid's traveller, smeared in mud, felt it. The teenage vandal, his face black with soot, felt it. And the modern adult, in a store-bought superhero costume, felt it too. The power to, for a moment, not be you. And this realization, this collective, playful, adult fascination with becoming the creature of the night, even for just a few hours, it began to change our relationship with those creatures. We were no longer just hiding from them. We were identifying with them. We were trying on their faces. And in doing so, we began to see them differently. The most terrifying of all the old figures, the witch, once the symbol of pure, female, demonic evil, she was about to look in the mirror, and her reflection, was about to change. And so, the adults joined the dance. They put on the mask, they painted their faces, and they let the wild, joyous, anonymous spirit of the old night loose in their own living rooms. Among all the borrowed faces, all the vampires, the ghosts, and the movie monsters, there was one that was worn more than any other. It was the face, the form of the witch. She was the enduring shadow, the true ancient queen of All Hallows Eve. But the face they wore, the woman at the party in the 1950s with a pointy hat and a plastic warty nose, the girl in the 1980s with the black lace dress and the silver amulet. This was not the witch that their ancestors had known. This was not the creature that had once been the single most terrifying embodiment of the night's evil. The reflection in the mirror had changed. For century upon century, she had been the ultimate terror. She was not a spirit from the other world, not a ghost, not a mindless monster. She was, the story said, far worse. She was human. She was the one who had made a choice, the one who had walked to the edge of the dark woods, to the lonely crossroads, and made a bargain with the shadows. She was the one who had rejected the light, the community, the church, in exchange for power. Her magic was not the playful magic of the poocher. It was the magic of the souring milk, the blighted crop, the sick child, the storm that sank the ship. She was the village's darkest fear, the scapegoat for all that was inexplicable and cruel in the world. Her face was not the face of a charming housewife. It was the face of the crone, the hag, the outcast, the woman who lived alone, who talked to her cat, whose eyes held a spark of an old and dangerous knowledge. And on Samhain, on All Hallows Eve, this was her night. This was when her power was greatest, when she and her dark master held their Sabbath. The bonfires were lit, in part, to ward her off. The fear of her was real. It was a fear that led to pyres and gallows and the stone-cold terror of the trial. The first crack in that reflection came, not with a spell, but with a laugh. It came when the guising of the adults began, when a woman, for the first time, dressed as a witch, for fun. The act of putting on the costume was an act of defilement against the fear itself. It was an act of taming. By turning the symbol of terror into a party game, the witch was, slowly, being declawed. She became a joke, a silly mask with a green face and a pointed hat. She was no longer the midnight threat. She was the person from the accounting department holding a drink and laughing by the punch bowl. The mask, the great tool of anonymity, was now being used to rob the monster of its power. And then, the new great electric storytellers began to weave their own spells. The 20th century took the witch and placed her on the silver screen. In 1939, a great green-faced witch flew on a broomstick over a land of pure colour. She was still evil, still terrifying, but she was also theatrical. She was a character. She had a theme song, a castle, and an army of flying monkeys. She was, in her own strange way, magnificent. The old, hidden village crone was gone, replaced by a grand, iconic villain. And then, a few decades later, a new kind of magic box entered the home, the television, and it invited the witch in, not for a seance, but for a situation comedy. Suddenly, the witch was a beautiful, charming suburban housewife who twitched her nose to clean the living room. Her power was not a threat, it was a convenience. The most powerful, most feared figure in the mythology of the night had been utterly and completely domesticated. This was the final, profound shift. The reflection had fully changed. As the century closed, the witch was no longer the villain. She was, more often than not, the hero. She was the misunderstood girl in the high school, the sisterhood of empowered women, the young boy who discovered his magical destiny. She was the symbol, not of a pact with evil, but of a connection to nature, to the old ways, to the hidden magical potential inside all of us. The girl who felt like an outsider, who felt she didn't fit. She looked at the witch and she saw a spark of herself. The witch was no longer the other. She was us. She was the archetype of the empowered, the rebellious, the magical, the free. And so, today the witch is the queen of the holiday, not as a figure of fear, but as a figure of celebration. Her pointy hat and her broom are the familiar, beloved icons of the season. Her story, the story of her terror, has been almost entirely forgotten by the children who wear her costume. We have looked into the dark reflection, and we have tamed the monster by embracing it. We have made her story safe. Her journey, from the gallows to the party, is complete. But the night is long, and the dark holds other stories. Not all of them are so willing to be tamed. Not all of them can be turned into a costume or a charming sitcom. Some stories still live in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. They are the new legends, the modern hauntings, the ones we tell, not at the party with a laugh, but in a hushed whisper, in the dark, on the long ride home. The party, at last, is over. The rubber masks, smelling faintly of plastic and sweat, are tossed onto a chair. The pointy witch hats are set aside. The children are asleep, or pretending to be. Their bags of candy clutched protectively, a sweet, colourful horde gathered against the dark. The streetlights outside cast their modern orange glow, and the carved pumpkins on the steps begin to soften, their candle-lit grins collapsing in on themselves. The night is, by all accounts, safe. The rituals have been performed, the treats have been given. The tame familiar monsters of the screen and the storybook have had their playful dance. And yet, the night is not quite settled. A silence has fallen, but it is not an easy one. It is in this quiet, in the car, on the long dark ride home from the party, or in the hushed whispers of a teenage sleepover long after the adults have gone to bed. It is here that the other ghosts are found, the truly modern ones, the ones who do not come with a costume or a script. These are the legends we tell in the dark. They are the new folklore, born not of misty forests but of concrete, steel, and the anonymous, lonely spaces of our new world. The call, the story goes, is coming from inside the house. This is, perhaps, the most perfect of the new legends. The terror is no longer the Aussie in the ancient mound. It is not the headless horseman on the bridge. The terror has passed the threshold. It has breached the sacred, protected hearth. The monster is not a spirit. It is a man. And he is already in. This story reflects a fear far colder, far more modern than the fear of the supernatural. It is the fear of the random, the human, the inexplicable, the darkness that looks just like us. The babysitter, alone in a stranger's house, is the new isolated traveller. The telephone, that miracle of modern connection, becomes the very wire that carries the threat. Or, consider the ritual that still passes between children, a new form of the old divination. It is not the peeling of an apple or the roasting of a nut to see the future. It is a dare. Go into the bathroom, the one room with a mirror and a lock, turn off the light, light a single candle, and stare into your own reflection in the dark and say her name 3 times, 5 times, 13 times. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. You are not trying to see your future husband. You are trying to see her, a spirit of pure female rage, a ghost, born of legend, who will, they say, appear in the glass, her face scarred, her eyes mad, reaching for you. This is the seance, reborn as a terrifying childhood game. It is a direct, willed, and personal invitation for the veil to thin. And every child who does it feels that same cold, electric spike of primal fear. The fear that this time, just maybe, it will work. These are the hauntings that belong to us. The phantom hitchhiker, seen on the long, dark ribbon of the interstate, a pale girl in a forgotten dress who asks for a ride, and then simply vanishes from the locked car, leaving only a cold spot and perhaps a puddle of water on the seat. She is the new, tragic spirit of the road, the modern, paved, lonely forest. These stories are our pukas. They are our new lemurs. They are the anxieties of a fast, isolated, and anonymous world, given a face, given a story. We have tamed the witch. We have domesticated the vampire. We have turned the monster into a mask that we can buy. So, we have had to invent new monsters. Monsters that reflect our fears. And so our modern Halloween is this strange, beautiful paradox. It is a night of profound commercial, childish safety. And at the same time, it is the one night where we whisper the stories that are truly, deeply unsafe. We have separated the ritual from the fear. The children get the candy. The adults get the parties. And the darkness gets the new legends. This is how our culture has learned to cope with the thinning of the veil. We've contained it with sugar, wrapped it in plastic and sold it back to ourselves, while telling ourselves new, chilling ghost stories in the dark. But this is only one story. This is our story. Far to the south, on these very same nights, the veil also thins. But the spirits who cross over, they are not met with fear or with tricks. They are met with marigolds and music and with a joyous feast. It is a different kind of night, a different kind of remembering. And so, as our own night of shadows settles, as the ghost stories are whispered and the candy wrappers litter the floor, a different kind of magic is unfolding. Let your mind drift south, across the border, into a land that holds a different, warmer memory. Here, in the hills and villages of Mexico, the air is not sharp with the chill of coming winter. It is warm, and it is alive with a scent. It is the deep, pungent, almost honey-like perfume of the cempasúchil, the marigold, the flower of the dead. And this scent, it is not a warning. It is a welcome. It is a pathway, lit not by a hollowed-out gourd, but by a million golden, fragrant petals. This is Dia de los Muertos, and it is a different kind of remembering. It does not share its roots with the druids in their misty forests. Its origins are older, planted in the rich, dark soil of Mesoamerica, in the profound cyclical worldview of the Aztec. To them, death was not an end. It was not a terror to be fled, nor a judgment to be feared. It was a continuation, a journey. The souls of the dead did not vanish. They simply moved to a different part of the world, a place called Mictlan, the land of the dead. And once a year, the goddess of that land, Mictecacihuatl, the Lady of the Dead, would permit them to return. The veil, for them, also thinned, but it was not a crack to be guarded. It was a doorway to be thrown wide open. When the Spanish came, bringing their crosses and their own calendar of saints, they encountered this powerful ancient belief, and just as the church had done in the misty Celtic lands, it saw a thing it could not erase. The festivals honouring the dead were too deep, too woven into the bones of the people. So the church, it moved them, it nudged the ancient summer celebrations and guided them gently until they settled on the same familiar sacred dates, November 1st, All Saints' Day, and November 2nd, All Souls' Day. And in this perfect, powerful syncretism, a new tradition was born, one that wore the mask of Catholicism, but whose heart was still beating to the ancient Aztec drum. And so the preparations begin. This is not a night of hiding. It is a night of hosting. The spirits of the ancestors are not ghosts to be feared. They are honoured guests. They are family coming home for a visit. And for a cherished guest, you prepare a feast. In the homes, the centerpiece, it's not a frightening decoration. It is the ofrenda, the altar. It is a thing of beauty, a cascade of colour and love, a photograph of the one who has passed, the smiling face of a grandmother, an uncle, a child. They are placed in a place of honour, and around them the offerings are arranged, their favourite food, a warm, rich stew, a dish of mole, a sweet, anise-scented pan de muerto, the bread of the dead, a glass of water, for they are thirsty from their long journey, perhaps a small glass of tequila, or a bottle of their favourite soda, salt for purification, and the candles, so many candles, a small constellation in the corner of the room, lighting the way, and everywhere the marigolds. They are scattered, their petals pulled and strewn, creating a golden, fragrant path, a bridge of flowers leading from the street, through the open door, right to the ofrenda. They are a beacon, their bright, earthy scent calling the souls, guiding them home through the darkness. The veil is not thin. It has been made into a beautiful, welcoming road. But the true heart of this night is not in the home. It is in the pantheon, the cemetery. On this night, the graveyard is not a place of fear. It is not a place of hushed, sorrowful whispers. It is the most alive place in town. It is a festival of light. Imagine it. The entire sprawling field of graves, which by day might be a quiet, sun-baked place, is now glowing. Hundreds, thousands of candles flicker on every tombstone, a warm, golden, soft light that pushes back the darkness. The air is thick with the scent of marigolds and couple, the sweet, sacred incense that rises in fragrant blue-grey plumes, and it is filled with sound. Families are here. They have been here all day, cleaning the graves, washing the stones, decorating them with flowers. And now, as night falls, they are not leaving. They are staying. They have brought a picnic. They have brought chairs. They have brought a guitar. A small band might be walking the rows, playing a favourite song. The family gathers around the graves of their beloved, their faces lit by the soft candle glow. They talk. They tell stories about the person who lies there. Not sad stories, but the funny ones. The memories that make them laugh. They eat. They drink. They sing. They are not mourning the dead. They are with them. They are having the annual family reunion. The living and the dead together for one night, sharing food, music, and memory. And what of the skeleton? The symbol of fear. The skull that our tradition uses to frighten. Here, it is a joke. It is a sweet. It is a calavera, a sugar skull, brightly decorated with colourful icing and sequins, often with a name written on the forehead, not in terror, but in affection. The calicas, the skeletons, are everywhere, but they are not rising from the grave to scare. They are depicted in art, in statues, as joyous, vibrant figures. They are dancing, they are playing guitars, they are getting married, dressed in fine clothes. They are alive. The skull here is not a symbol of death. It is a symbol that death is not a symbol of fear. It is a profound, joyful, and deeply human mockery of death, a statement that life and memory and love are stronger. This, then, is the other path, where the Celtic-born tradition, in its modern American form, became a night of simulation, of pretending to be monsters, of simulated fear, of a ritualized extortion for candy. This other, older Aztec-born tradition is one of communion. One tradition built a wall of masks and mischief to hide from the spirits. The other built a bridge of flowers to welcome them home. It is a reminder that the need to acknowledge the thinning of the veil, the need to touch the mystery of the departed at the turning of the year, is a thread that runs through all of humanity. It is only the way we do it that changes, and it is a reminder that the veil is indeed an enduring thing. It is always there, this delicate, fragile curtain, and the ghosts, whether we fear them, or buy them off, or invite them for dinner, they never, ever truly leave. And so, we see them. Two paths born of the same ancient human impulse, diverging in the twilight of the year. One, a path of marigolds and music, a bridge built of love, inviting the ancestors home for a feast. The other, a path of masks and mischief, a ritual of play, designed to appease, to tame, and to sweetly buy off the spirits of the dark. Both, in their own beautiful, complex way, are an answer. They are an answer to the same quiet, insistent question. The question of the enduring veil, this thin, strange, and fragile curtain that separates the world we see from the world we sense. We have travelled a long, long road to arrive at this, our final night. We have walked from the misty forests of the Celts, our faces lit by the Tyne Snam, the sacred bonfire. We've hidden behind the first crude masks of wood and straw. We've seen the Roman apple merge with the Druid's magic. We've heard the small, sad souler's cry, a prayer for a simple cake. We crossed the vast dark ocean, carrying a dying ember of that memory. We watched that ember find a new home, a new orange, grinning face, the face of the Pumpkin King, born of an Irish legend and an American land. We felt the terror of the Headless Horseman, a ghost born of a new nation's violent past. We sat in the velvet dark of the Victorian parlour, our fingers touching, waiting for a rap from the other side. We ran through the streets, our faces black with soot, on the wild night of mischief, turning the ordered world upside down. We learned the three magic words, the perfect transactional spell, trick or treat. We tasted the sweet, safe, candy-coated surrender of the modern age. We watched the witch, the ancient figure of terror, change her face in the mirror from hag to hero. We whispered the new legends, the modern hauntings, the call coming from inside the house. And just last night, we sat in a graveyard in Mexico, lit by 1,000 candles, sharing a meal with the dead. And now, here we are. The journey is at its end. The fire has burned low, to embers. And the question remains, why? Why, after all this time, after all our science and our electric light, do we still feel it? Why does the veil endure? Perhaps the veil is not a thing of the world. Perhaps it is a thing of the heart. It is not a date on a calendar, but a feeling. It is a time at the death of the year when the sun is weak and the nights are long, and the earth itself seems to hold its breath. And in that stillness we listen. The veil thins because we allow it to. We are, at this moment, more open to the echoes. We are more attuned to the past. The chill in the air is not just a drop in temperature, it is a reminder of our own fragility. The falling leaf is not just botany, it is a lesson in mortality. And in this moment, our thoughts turn, as they always have, to those who walked this path before us. The ghosts, you see, they never truly leave, because the ghosts are memory. That is the secret. As long as one person, in one small quiet room, remembers a story, the druid still watches as fire. As long as one child, in a sheet, runs laughing down a suburban street, the solar is still walking, his lantern held high. As long as one family gathers to tell a funny story about a grandmother who is past, she is there at the table, laughing with them. The ghosts are not intruders. They are us. They are the past that we are made of. We no longer fear the owl sea. We no longer need to hide from the spirits of the forest. We have wrapped our rituals in plastic and sugar. We have tamed the terror. But we have not banished the need to remember, the need to connect, the need just for one night to acknowledge the great, beautiful, and profound mystery that surrounds our small, warm, lighted lives. The need to put on a mask, to become something else, to touch the wildness, to feel the electric, ancient pulse of a time outside of time. And so, our story ends. The great history of this night, it is not truly finished. It is still being written, in every candle lit, in every costume chosen, in every story told. Thank you. Thank you for walking with me through this long, long journey, for listening to the whispers of the forgotten, for sitting by this hearth as we unspooled the threads of the past. The tale is told, the night is quiet. Now it is time for you to rest. Let the story fade, like the embers of the last fire. It is time to close your eyes. The world is safe. The spirits are at peace. Let the silence hold you. And perhaps in your dreams tonight, you will meet them. The ones we have spoken of. The Roman with his apple. The Victorian with her hopeful heart. The ancient ones from 1,000 years ago. They are, after all, just on the other side of the veil. Waiting. Sleep well.